How does the deal set Israel up should they decide to act unilaterally? And what would happen should they act?
I mean,
militarily.
It's more or less broadly conceded that the deal constrained what the Israelis are able to do for the next few years, simply because the Iranian nuclear program is under international sponsorship right now. The annexes say that the Russians and the Chinese and so on, and to a certain extent the Europeans, are now obligated to help the Iranians.
But if Israel were to be found in sabotaging things, could Israel come against the interests of the next?
I don't think anybody knows that. I really don't think anybody knows that. I mean, the true answer is this deal constrains Israel.
It constrains Israel.
Yeah,
do you think that was part of the agenda of the administration?
No, I don't think that part of the deal had anything to do with Israel. I think it had to do with structuring the deal.
Just a couple weeks ago, February 26th, the IAEA issues its quarterly report on Iran. It's supposed to do it every quarter, and it doesn't have any of the information that it traditionally has. It has some, but it leaves out things that they've been reporting on for a decade. It left out the total amount of low-enriched uranium that the Iranians had. It left out the amount of high-enriched uranium that the Iranians had. It didn't talk about a certain kind of centrifuge rotor that we're particularly interested in. It didn't talk about whether the Iranians have made any progress toward implementing what's called the additional protocol, which has to do with the inspection regime. And they were hammered for it. They were hammered for it on February 26th by one of the top think tanks in the city, David Albright's think tank, the Institute for Science and International Security. And then a week later, they were hammered up for it by Ali Hanonen again. That morning, the subsequent Monday, Director General Amano is giving a press conference in Vienna, and he's asked, what's with these omissions? You guys are getting criticized by your own colleagues. And he says, well, what you don't understand, he says it's a clear misunderstanding, he says. What you don't understand is under the new nuclear deal, we actually report less than we used to, which triggered a firestorm that again required figuring out what was going on, and we still don't know. Last we heard, the Americans had asked for clarification, congratulated him on his work, and asked for more info. And then, of course, don't miss this. It's an incredibly important problem. The lack of forcing Iran to come clean, the lack of forcing them to let us establish a baseline on their past work, does enormous damage. And we know it does enormous damage. How do we know? As part of the congressional summer fight, the administration was required to provide Congress all details of the deal, plus a set of annexes, anything having to do with the deal. They didn't provide the partial self-inspections annex, by the way. Of those documents, 2 of them had to do with PMDs. Document number 2 said, we've collapsed on PMDs, but it's okay, we're not worried about it. Document 3 said, and then it said, to find out why we're not worried about it, see classified document 3. So nobody knew what was going on. The Wall Street Journal got a hold of the second document, and its scoop was that we collapsed on PMDs. Bloomberg got a hold of the third document, the classified document, and it said, our intelligence community doesn't think we need a baseline as long as the Iranians completely cooperate at every step for the next 15 years. Right? Classified assessment. So we know that the PMDs is a problem. Now, we'll wrap it up. That's the will it work section. Now is the is it worth it section. There are 3 overarching costs that have been identified. The first is the structure of the deal itself. At the end of this, 12 to 15 years from now, the Iranians will have a legal, unlimited nuclear program enabling them to do legal, unlimited heavy water plutonium work and legal, unlimited enrichment as much as they want to whatever level they want. They will legally be within a screw's turn of a nuclear weapon with their legal program. There will be no sanctions regime on their nuclear program. Problem number 1, the structure. Problem number 2 and 3 are just the costs. This is a deal that in the meantime boosts Iran's nuclear and conventional capabilities. What does that mean? Let's break it down. The nuclear part of it. again, I referenced this earlier, in order to sweeten the pot in Vienna, to essentially bribe the Iranians to take the deal, one of the things we did is we committed to working with them on peaceful nuclear technology. The problem with that is it makes us the sponsor of their nuclear program. Secretary Kerry and Energy Secretary Moniz were asked about this particular passage in congressional testimony during the summer fight. And the question that Secretary Kerry got was, hey, this wording seems really weird. It sort of seems like if the Israelis decide to cyber attack Iranian nuclear infrastructure because they don't want the Iranians to progress even as a peaceful nuclear power, doesn't this put us on the side of the Iranians against our American allies? And Secretary Kerry's answer was, don't worry about it, it'll never come to that. That's worrying, because a lot of people think that it'll exactly come to that. And then, of course, there's all of the arguments about boosting their conventional military program. We lifted the ballistic missile embargo. We sunsetted it in 8 years. We sunset the arms embargo at 5 years. It turns out, we found out this week, last week now, that the ballistic missile concession was actually 2 things. One was we agreed to get rid of it after 8 years, but the second was that we agreed to weaken it in the process. So the old language prohibiting the Iranians from developing ballistic missiles was locked into something called UN Security Council Resolution 1929. And it said the Iranians shall not develop ballistic missiles. Technically what it said is they shall not develop missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. The new language says the Iranians are called upon not to develop missiles designed to be capable of nuclear weapons. Both of those differences. One, the switch from shall not to called upon not to. 2, the switch from missile capable of carrying a ballistic missile to missile designed to be capable of carrying a ballistic missile. Shall not versus calls upon is obvious to you. It's much weaker language. It seems non-binding. And in fact, it will turn out to have been non-binding. Designed is even more subtle, though. Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif bragged explicitly, openly, in as many words, last week, said, don't pretend that design doesn't matter. I spent 7 months negotiating over that one word. Everyone knew what it means. And what does it mean? The Iranians, 2 weeks ago, Tuesday and Wednesday, launched ballistic missiles. They test them. The first set is actually military tests. They weren't tests, they were actual launches. They were part of military exercises. 800-kilometer missiles. The video that the Iranians had, they put out a propaganda video. The video has this lifelike tour of a tunnel. So you know in movies, right, you're traveling through a tunnel at speed, and then it stops at the entrance of the tunnel. And on the floor of the missile silo is painted an Israeli flag so that the scientists can walk over it on the way to launching the missiles. The next day, maybe the Iranians thought that was too subtle a message. They test launched 2 2,000-kilometer range ballistic missiles. They published photographs of the missile launches with stamped on the side, Israel must be wiped out, in Hebrew. Which is to say these were 2 launches that were aimed at Israel. The United States goes to the United Nations, says we've got this deal, we've got Security Council Resolution 2231, says they shall not launch ballistic missiles designed to be capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. They did. Let's have a meeting. The Russians say, no, that's not. The resolution doesn't prohibit ballistic missile launches. It says they shouldn't do it. It asks them not to do it. But as Russian Foreign Minister Churkin says, listen, you may not like it, but there's a legal distinction between called upon and shall not. And you can't violate a request. And so even in the meantime, the 8 years, the Iranians do not seem to be bound to what used to be a fairly rigorous ballistic missile embargo. And that's the ballgame. That is the question. For the deal, even if it works, is it worth it? That's been the structure of the debate since at least summer before. Those are most of the issues. There's some other costs that get talked about, federalism, separation of powers, endangering the global financial system by letting them back in. But that's basically the overview. So let's spend the rest of our time on questions. Yes, sir. Sure. So the question is, a lot of the presidential candidates have said a lot of presidential candidates have said that they're going to tear up the deal. I think the last one is now that's still in is Cruz. What would tearing up the deal look like? In a technical sense, tearing up the deal from our end would be the reimposition of nuclear sanctions that we promised to remove. So we would say, listen, this deal, it turns out, sucks for us. We'd rather try to destroy your nuclear program through economic warfare than through having you limited. We're going to reimpose the sanctions that we lifted. The problem with that is there's all kinds of ways that the Iranians have said would also count as us tearing up the deal. The most obvious being, the Iranians have a much more expansive definition of what counts as reimposing sanctions than we do. One obvious example, and then we'll get to another question. In the immediate aftermath of the San Bernardino jihadist attacks, Congress said, we're going to tighten up our visa program. Right now, if you are a dual national, if you carry a passport, you can be an Iranian national, but if you carry a passport from a different country that we have a visa agreement with, the Europeans, the Australians, whoever, you can come into this country on your non-Iranian passport without needing a visa. This makes sense, right? When we travel to Europe, we don't need visas. When they travel here, they don't need visas. It facilitates travel. But Congress said, listen, there are millions of potential Sunni jihadists streaming into Europe. There are places like Germany where there are legal Hezbollah agents. Germany has 950 to 1,000 fully registered legal Hezbollah agents. If some German Hezbollah agent, dual national, goes to the Iranian holy city of Qom, where they train their arch-terrorists and their clerics, and he spends 5 weeks there and suddenly he wants to travel into the country, we'd like him to have a visa interview before he comes in. That's what Congress says. The Iranians say that will be a violation of the nuclear deal, you're not allowed to do it. And their exact argument was that, if business traveler, the other part of the visa regime is, even if you're not a dual citizen, but you're just a German, Brit, whatever, who travels to Iran within the last 5 years, or any other state sponsor of terrorism, Syria, there were 5 that we mentioned, the Sudan, North Korea. The Iranians say, listen, if a British businessman or businesswoman knows that if they travel to Iran, they're going to need visas to get into the US for the next 5 years, they're not going to go to Iran. That's going to cut down on our business. That would count as a sanctions violation. And indeed, the administration accepted that argument and instituted a loophole for Iranian business over the explicit objections of Congress, to the point that congressional leadership sent a letter to the president saying, if you do this, saying, really, you guys brought this concern to us during the lead-up. We said, no, it is not valid to give Iran business-based waivers. If you do this, it will be brazenly illegal. That's a letter that went from everyone from leadership, plus everyone involved in crafting that law, specifically that amendment. And the administration did it anyway. So this is another way of saying it's not clear what would count as tearing up the deal. Reimposing sanctions would definitely do it, but the Iranians have a long list of definitions. No, behind. Let's do the 10 minutes back and then
What do you think of the President of the United States
Sure.
Do you think it was an Iranianism? Surprise? Is it cynicism? He doesn't care that he feels that if it breaks up, it'll break up after he serves his term? Or do you think that by inducing the Iranians to negotiate international agreements, they will somehow modify their behavior?
It's a good question. This is the question everybody asks. The deal sucks, why did the president sign on to it? Everyone has their own theories. There are multivalence theories. They go through, he wanted another peace prize, although that doesn't really make sense because it would be Secretary Kerry and one that so forget it. He thinks the Iranians will moderate, which many people in the administration does. They think, listen, I mean, Bloomberg View wrote this in as many, everyone's written this in as many words. If the Iranians moderate in 12 years when their program goes legal, The president was a genius. If the regime, and avoid war, if the regime does not, then the president legalized the nuclear program of one of the worst regimes on the planet. He's definitely counting to some extent on moderation. There's an additional theory. It travels under various banners. It's often called the Duran thesis after Hudson scholar Michael Duran. But really it was developed over several years by a set of scholars here in town. Tony Bedron at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Lee Smith also at Hudson, Michael Ledeen at FDD again. And this says, listen, the president has been pursuing not just nuclear negotiations with Iran, but a whole new relationship with Iran, rapprochement. And under this theory, the nuclear negotiations were not so much meant to deal with the nuclear program as to get the nuclear program out of the way so they could pursue a new era of relations. There was a lot of debate on this. He developed this. He was at Brookings. He was called a cockamamie conspiracy theorist by his boss for writing an article about this. In the last week, the buzz of this town is the interview that Jeffrey Goldberg did with President Obama, in which the president says, listen, one of the things that the Saudis have to realize, and that we've told them, is they got to learn to share the region with Iran, which is providing fuel for this so-called Duran thesis. But listen, the president thinks this is a good deal. Their argument is, right now the Iranians are 6 weeks to 12 weeks away from a bomb. In 10 years, they'll be 6 weeks to 12 weeks away from a bomb. Why are you coming at us? The president said in as many words, and I quote, because this quote got around, so I remember it specifically, I have not heard a single good argument against the Iran deal. Right, he said that during the debate. He could be telling the truth.
What's magical about 1 year for a breakout? What's the advantage of 1 year?
There is no technical, what's the advantage of 1 year? Why was it settled upon? There is no technical basis in physics for why 1 year rather than 13 months rather than 11 months. It just sounded good because they found out that that's easy to sell because 1 year sounds like a lot. There's no technical reason. The claim is 1 year is enough. 1 year is enough to detect if the Iranians try to break out.
And we detect it, then what?
Well, this is actually an interesting question. So we detect them, and then what? Critics of the deal hammer it. Mark Dubowitz, the executive director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, has hit this point very hard. If the Iranians cheat in the aftermath of us shredding the global sanctions regime, and don't underestimate how completely we have destroyed the sanctions regime, right? Most people think it can't be reconstructed without a decade. We dismantled functionally all the sanctions regime. All the things that had brought the Iranians to the brink of a massive economic collapse. And we will learn over the next 6 months. There are several books coming out that say that if the president could have pushed for another 6 months, you could have brought down the Iranian regime, you could have collapsed the Iranian regime. No, I'm sorry, I take that back. You could have collapsed the Iranian economy. What happened to the regime then is an open question. But all of those measures no longer exist. And the point of critics is, all right, so the problem now is, if the Iranians cheat, America has only the military option to stop them. Right? That the deal took away anything that we could possibly do except military action. And in that sense, it really limits what a future president can do. But they would come back and say, listen, right now, our options are only military options. In 10 years, they'll only be military options. And they even went so far as to say, not only are the options the same, but after 10 to 12 years of having transparency into the Iranian program, we'll know exactly what to bomb. Now that claim turned out not to be true because it's just not the way that our intel works, but they went so far as to say, listen, the military option now exists, the military option will exist in 12 years. If anything, we'll know more. What are we losing? I think this.
What do we already know about the North Korean relationship with Iran's nuclear development, and what do we not know?
Sure. So this is a question, what are the known knowns, what are the known unknowns about North Korean, Iranian nuclear cooperation, and we should add ballistic missile cooperation. Let me step back for a second. During the fight over the Iran deal, there were a few days where the North Koreans tested something in a very, very obvious and brazen way. It has to do with the details of their program, but it was a specific kind of missile that they tested in a specific kind of way. And people started talking about this Iranian North Korean channel much more. It has been known for a decade that the Iranians functionally fund the North Korean ballistic missile and nuclear program. The reason this is concerning is both obvious but also technical. Let me start with the technical one, and then we'll get to the obvious one. The technical concern goes something like this. We'll use pseudo-technical language. The Iran nuclear deal is designed to freeze or sharply limit all Iranian nuclear activity. It is meant to be a comprehensive deal. But there are hundreds of kilograms of enriched uranium that are unaccounted for in Syria. Last we heard, they might have been on a Hezbollah military base. So if this deal is designed to prevent Iran breakout by keeping them to 300 kilograms, and they have more in Syria, you see what that does to the breakout time. This deal is meant to freeze a lot of development into centrifuges and so on. But if the North Koreans are doing research on Iran's behalf, then you can see how it would limit the nuclear deal. Which is another way of saying that under this theory, when you kind of widen the aperture about what counts as the Iranian nuclear program, the deal merely froze it inside Iran's geographical borders, while work continues in North Korea and stockpiles may continue to exist in Syria. Now, what do we know about their cooperation? We don't know much. Anybody who claims to know a lot about North Korea is misleading you, and that's both true in the intelligence community and in general with journalists. We do know a number of things. We know that the Iranians exchange centrifuge knowledge with the North Koreans. We know that Iranian scientists, we strongly suspect that Iranian scientists have been present at North Korean nuclear tests. Why would they be there? We know the Iranians fund the nuclear program. By the way, to be fair, we don't actually know what Iran gets back from funding the North Korean nuclear program. The North Koreans do not give away anything for free. They're paranoid even about their allies. There's a very good analyst in town, one of the intelligence community's most distinguished veterans, the only guy to have ever won an award for a military award for intelligence work. And he says all this claptrap about North Korean Iranian cooperation is overblown. It's by people who've never studied the North Koreans. The North Koreans don't give anything for free. So we don't even know, there's debates even within the hard-nosed intelligence community about how much we know. But what we suspect is very worrying.
One follow-up. Was it ever part of the negotiation process, any of the uranium that was outside the borders of Iran?
No.
Did it ever start there?
No. The deal was limited to what happens within Iran's borders.
Certain Israeli generals, at least it came out in the news that they said that the deal wasn't so bad.
Yeah.
What was that all about?
Good question. There are times when we're discussing Iranian nuclear physics where it's important, or North Korean Iranian cooperation, where it's important to be nuanced, to present both sides of the argument, to give a fair hearing. And then there are times where there's not. The question we just got is one of the times where fairness isn't really called for. During the summer debate, there was a fact sheet that was circulated by groups that are what we call administration validators, so the coalition on the other side. Now, by the way, don't underestimate the sophistication, in fact, it was unprecedented sophistication, of the communications work that went into selling the Iran deal. It was unprecedented. This gets insidery, but there are groups like the Plowshares Network who put up videos titled How We Won that explained how they set up war rooms and how they lined up validators and how they had rapid response so that anytime a claim came out, there was a counterclaim, and how they produced fact sheets. To give you an idea of this network, during the Vienna talks, the conservative the cool kids here in Washington, D.C. in journalism, the Washington Free Beacon, got a hold of a recording that had been done that day in the middle of the Vienna talks. That was the coalition of people who were from groups that were going to support the Iran deal. It was a strategy session. It was a conference called Strategy Session. And this is in the middle of Vienna, and they discuss how these groups are all going to cooperate to push the deal once it comes out. And there's a moment during this call. One of the three people who was leading the call was the husband of a top Democratic supporter in the House of the deal. And there's a moment during the debate, during the conference call, where he says, he's talking on and on and on about how they should support the deal, and then his wife turns to him, they're apparently working in the same office, and says, and don't forget to tell them that they have to emphasize over and over and over again that it's a good deal. This is before the deal's finalized. How do they know it's a good deal? Right, like this is before we knew about the terrorists no longer being sanctioned. It's before we knew about the ballistic missile exemptions. It's before we knew about the arms embargo. So they had a sophisticated communications network set up to do it. One of the things they needed, there's very few polite ways to say this. One of the things they needed is validation from Jewish groups, and preferably from the Israelis. And a fact sheet was developed and circulated that had quotes that were ostensibly from the Israeli security establishment about why the deal was a good deal. So that these validators could say, even the Israelis say it's a good deal. Or if they were being more sophisticated, what they said is there's a split in Israel between Bibi, who will never be satisfied, and the serious adults in the security establishment who think it's a good deal. That list was crap. It didn't include a number of things. The first is it cut off their quotes. So a lot of those quotes were, yes, the deal removes Iran from being able to go instantly nuclear in 10 years. And by the way, anybody who denies that is just wrong. Like, if the deal works, then Iran can't go nuclear for 10 years. But, ... It'll make them a conventional threat, it'll empower them, it'll embroil the region in conflict, etc. Some of them were from people who had no business talking about whether the Iran deal was a good deal or a bad deal. They were intelligence people or security people, but they had no business. Emily Landau, who's one of Israel's top nuclear experts, got so frustrated with this list always being emailed to her and shoved in her face that she wrote an article that said, listen, this should be a basic distinction, but there's a difference between policy analysts who evaluate the big picture, is the costs worth it, and nuclear analysts who say, will it work, on one side, who get to speak to the deal, and other people who just happen to be in the security world and analyze intelligence, who have no business talking about either the big picture or the granular picture. And she said this fact sheet is filled with the people on the second side. So that, but it was a product created for a communications campaign that was used in a particular way, and was used for the reason it was created. Sir?
So it's no secret that Israel's the #1 target for a nuclear bomb from Iran. I mean, the propaganda's been out there that they're going to wipe Israel off the face of the map.
Sure.
Bibi Netanyahu came to speak at Congress warning everyone on how dangerous it would be and how we should vote against it.
Sure.
We are all here on AIPAC, which is the largest bipartisan group, fighting for things that are good or bad for Israel. My question to you is, what do you think the answer is how did AIPAC fail when it spoke to so many congressmen and senators, and so many people that we were hoping would vote against it turn out to vote in favor of it and let us all down?
This is the question that was asked in town a couple, for months afterwards, and people wrote AIPAC postmortems. Let me first deal with what's behind that question, and then get back to the actual summer fight. If you divide up Washington, D.C., you have politics, policy, and public affairs. Politics is the Hill and lobbyists who work with them. In our world, AIPAC is that lobby. Policy is bureaucrats, people at the State Department, Treasury, Energy, and the people who work with them are think tankers. In our world, that's the Washington Institute, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, AEI, and so on. And then you have public affairs. Those are journalists and the people who work with them. This is my organization, the Israel Project, where we do the strategic comms, which is to say, I talk to a bunch of journalists every day about these issues. And I told one of them a couple days ago, we're actually talking about the Trump controversy that's set to crescendo on Monday. And I told him, listen, you guys have to be careful when you're writing this. You and your friends wrote a bunch of postmortems for AIPAC after the summer fight, and you said that both they couldn't get any, they were going to lose support, and Democrats would never talk to them again because they had just dumped $40 million in ads on Democratic heads. Well, this is the largest policy conference ever, and the Democratic frontrunner and the vice president and Democratic leadership are all talking here. So let's be careful about calling the body a little early. This is the conversation I had with them. Now, going back. It's not technically correct that the only goal of the summer fight was to defeat the bill legislatively. And now I'm going to talk to you as kind of a DC, in DC speak. The goal was across politics, policy, and public affairs to defeat the bill and explain to people why it was a bad idea and convince them that it was a bad idea. We succeeded in 2 out of those 3. What do I mean by that? We failed on the big one. We had a problem getting Democrats. On the other hand, the President of the United States is the most powerful man, inhabits the most powerful office in the most powerful country that's ever existed on the face of the earth. So we failed on that one. But, again, think about politics, policy, public affairs. What would it mean to defeat the bill in a policy sense? Well, it would mean something relatively straightforward. It would mean convincing the policy folks that this was a bad deal. And FDD took the lead on this in a big way. And they testified in front of Congress almost 20 times. And by the end of it, I mean, I'm now speaking for myself, obviously we live in a closed bubble, but by the end of it, parts of the bill were a punchline. And every time that the administration reveals another concession, for instance, this week, the ballistic missile concession, you see echoes of that, where people said, we told you it was a bad deal. And on the public affairs side, support for this deal went from 52% in a Pew poll that was done immediately after it was announced, to where it is, to 25, to where it is today, 30%. The public, as well as policy elites, were convinced it was a bad deal. Now, none of that would have been achieved without the 2-month congressional battle that came as a result of AIPAC's ability to work in a bipartisan fashion in order to get the Corker-Cardin window open. So what do I mean by that? The president and the administration wanted to just have their deal. They wanted to negotiate their deal and have their deal. AIPAC fought to ensure that there would be congressional oversight. That congressional oversight, for technical reasons, turned out to be a 2-month congressional battle filled with hearings and disclosures and reports and controversy. And I'm telling you as a press guy, if that hadn't existed, I couldn't have worked with any journalists, couldn't have convinced any journalists that it was worth their time to cover the deal for more than a couple of days, because they would have said, we're not going to, there's no news here. And if they wouldn't have said there's no news here, their editors would have said there's no news here. All of the things that we discovered about the flaws in the deal, the collapse on PMDs, the disclosure, that the U.S. intelligence agency is okay with it, but only if the Iranians cooperate, the harsh and self-inspections, the ballistic missile stuff, all of that stuff we discovered because there was a firestorm of congressional controversy here in town that was enabled by the Corker-Cardin legislation. Now, Corker-Cardin had as one of its provisions the idea that Congress should defeat the deal if it's a bad idea. We lost that fight. But we were only able to have a fight and to set up and to explain to the American people that it was, and convince the American people that it was a terrible deal because the fight happened in the first place. Don't undervalue the gains that were made just because we were able to have that fight. And the only reason we're able to have that fight is AIPAC's ability to work in a bipartisan fashion to get the Corker-Cardin legislation through Congress. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry.
Oh. You talk loudly and then we'll get to you. Yeah. Okay, so question. Evaluate the coziness between Secretary of State Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif. There are theories that go around that go as far as to say that Mr. Zarif's son was at Zarif's son's wedding, or that Zarif stayed with Kerry. Those aren't true. As near as anybody can tell, those aren't true, and there are very, very good journalists who would have found that out. But, like any conspiracy theory, there's a grain of truth, and it sells because it resonates. The nuclear negotiations, let's go back to the Duran thesis, that the nuclear negotiations were meant as not to resolve the nuclear question, but to move the United States and the Iranians closer together. That happened. By July, which is to say, by the beginning of the final Vienna talks, at which we would collapse on terrorists and so on and designations, the Associated Press, America's oldest newswire, was ready to report, not analyze, not quote, to report that there was that coziness between the American negotiating team and the Iranian negotiating team was the new normal. To report, not to assess or quote. January 13, 2016, Bradley Clapper from the Associated Press publishes the following. He says, listen, there's been 12 days in January so far, 12 days in January 2016. During that time, Secretary Kerry has spoken to Foreign Minister Zarif at least 11 times. He's spoken to his European counterparts once or twice, no more, sometimes zero. Ditto for our Gulf allies. And so it is undeniable that there's coziness between the Secretary and the Foreign Minister, but I would avoid explaining that from the context of the conspiracy theories. I don't think those are true, but there's undeniably professional level and perhaps even personal level coziness. Ma'am?
So you mentioned Russia says you can't violate a request.
Yeah.
So without this deal, what would the consequences have been?
For ballistic missiles?
For the ballistic missiles, what would the consequences have been?
If there had been no deal, so November 2013, there is a, as of November 2013, as of July 2015, there are 6 binding United Nations Security Council resolutions affecting the Iranians, obligating the Iranians to cease altogether all uranium work, all heavy water work, and all ballistic missile work. When the deal was negotiated, there was a new Security Council resolution negotiated, 2231, that weakened the language. So technically, had there been no deal, Resolution 1929 would still be in force, and the Iranians would be in black letter violation of international law and subject to sanctions or secondary sanctions. In technical sense, they'd be subject to United Nations level sanctions under the Security Council's Chapter 7 powers. Or more clearly, it would be illegal. Now there are arguments that it's not illegal. Sir? Sure, so the question is, there was, depending on who you ask, between 50 billion and 150 billion in Iranian offshore oil assets. So what would happen is that under the United Nations Security Council resolutions, the Iranians were only allowed to sell their oil for a limited number of, to use oil money to purchase a limited number of things. Health and dual use, and health technology, no dual use technology, and so on. Food. The problem is they couldn't spend all that money. So it built up in these escrow accounts. How much there was, nobody knows. Originally, we thought it was 150 billion. The administration then said 100 billion. They eventually started testifying that it's only 50 billion, except it probably turned out to be 100 billion because when it was released and the Iranians bragged about it in January, this happened, by the way. When it was released, one of the top national security journalists for the Wall Street Journal, Jay Solomon, tweeted something snarky about it, because the Iranians were like, all $100 billion has been released at once. And so I think that, that Ms. Solomon tweeted something like, oh, it does turn out to be 100 billion. And the administration's top communications person on the Iran deal, Marie Harf, tweets back at him. Right? She's going to answer. He says on the tweet, the administration lied. They said it was 50 billion, but now the Iranians say it was 100 billion. And she said, listen, Jay, don't accuse the administration of lying. You have to understand, it wasn't the State Department that thought it was 50 billion. You have to understand it was Treasury that thought it was 50 billion. Don't blame us. Right? So maybe it was closer in the end to 100 billion than to 50 billion. Why was it all released all at once? Because the pretext, the logical pretext for it, was that it was Iran's money in the first place. So how could we keep it from them anymore? If you don't believe that it's Iran's money in the first place, then why are you releasing it at all? If you're going to release it at all, you need to convince people that it's Iran's money in the first place, and if that's the argument, then what's the pretext for not releasing it at all? Sir?
2 questions. One, what can you say about the argument that we're just delaying an inevitable war with boots on the ground?
Sure.
And second, how would it look on the global stage if the United States was the only major Western power that rejected the deal?
Yeah. 2 questions. Let me take the second one first. How would it look if the US was the last holdout? That is a premise that needs to be pushed on. There are plentiful rumors. Well, it has been reported that the French sat down with members of Congress and said the equivalent of, listen, I'm sure you've heard that if the US rejects the deal, the rest of the world will walk on without us. Yeah, it's probably not true. We'll probably just go along with whatever Congress says. It's easier for us. We don't have any love lost for the Iranians. So it's not exactly true that the US would have been the only one. We would have taken our allies with us. But there's a second level debate here, and it's one that you're going to be hearing more and more often. It'll probably come up at least as an undertone in the election, and it's certainly part of the discussion here in town, which is it gets a little bit tiresome to hear American diplomats say things like, we had no choice, or we did our best, and there was no better option. There was a moment in Lausanne where, I'm now trying to edit in my mind the way to say this appropriately. I was talking with a journalist, and they had just come out with this Fordo thing, and they were saying it's the best we could do. And there was a discussion among some journalists, and it's like, well, why don't you try a thing? Try succeeding for a while, instead of just saying it's the best you can do. Right? Instead of making bad policy and say that it's the best you can do, put your foot down. See if you can win. And let me tell you, if the United States went to its allies and said, hey, we know this is going to piss you off, but we're going to go after the Iranians on an economic level, and you're going to have to choose our market or their market, and we're going to tell your companies they have to choose our market or their market, the rest of the world would not abandon us and keep going. And by the way, when we say the rest of the world, let's be clear that we're already not talking about the Saudis and the Israelis who are way to the right of us. Second is, will this end in a war? Nobody can know. All we know is that it's now, assuming that the deal fails, it's now almost guaranteed that the US would have to take military action, probably not boots on the ground. Iran's a big country, 80 million people. But if the deal works, then the threat of war is receded. It's a question of whether the deal works or not. Somebody we haven't gotten to yet. Is there anybody who hasn't asked a question who wants to ask one? Is the Iran deal premised on, at least from administration thinking, to what degree was it probably premised on a hope for moderation? Probably a lot. Regime change is a word I wouldn't want to use because I don't think this administration thinks that regime change is possible. But certainly they think that the Iranian regime will moderate in a way that it can be dealt with. Some of them think that the Iranian regime can moderate in a way that it can be dealt with, and it becomes very difficult to justify the deal if you don't assume Iranian moderation, which I think is a better argument. That gentleman hasn't spoken.
So I might be misinformed because I'm obviously here to learn more, but I remember Obama going on TV saying Iran will never get a nuke and that this deal will make sure of it. But a lot of what we're talking about now is how it's going to delay it.
Yeah.
So how is the deal designed to make sure they never get a nuke?
So the administration says, in a line that is, if we're all here among friends, kind of childish and obnoxious, the administration says this is a forever deal. It doesn't expire. How do they say that? Because they assume that as part of the deal, Iran will sign on to things like the additional protocol, which is an inspection regime. The problem is the Iranians had already committed to signing the protocol. Now, by the way, if you go back and you read, one of the main talking points that the administration used is that under this deal, Iran agrees to never construct a nuclear weapon. It was one of their main talking points. And the reason it was one of their main talking points is because they saw the same thing in their polling data that we saw, which is that it's one of the things that people thought was the best aspect of the deal. Problem with that is the Iranians had already committed to never constructing a nuclear weapon. They're members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, under which they had already committed not to do it. But the administration, if you look at their fact sheets and so on, it's prioritized. That is what they mean by Iran never gets a nuke. Down the middle, I think I've tried to be very clear when I'm giving you a one-sided argument, a skeptic argument, pro-argument. Down the middle, if you ask nuclear experts, they'll say this is a deal designed to last about 12 to 15 years. All of the effective limitations on how much they can enrich, to what level they can enrich, whether they can use heavy water reactors, expire after 15 years. Sir hasn't spoken. What? Yeah. Sure. Iran's gone nuclear. It's one of the big questions. The Iranians say because we weren't trying. The IAEA says you were conducting tests that were relevant to the development of nuclear weapons. What do you mean you weren't trying? Listen, we know some things. We know that there were cyber attacks on Iranian nuclear infrastructure that set them back a month here, a month there. We know other things. We know that their nuclear scientists kept getting killed for a while. We also have a debate inside the policy community about how good the Iranians actually are at what they're trying to do. One of the arguments you hear from people, who promote renewed warming ties between the US and Iran is the Iranians are an ancient civilization, they're a great power, they're going to be a great power, get on the right side of them, they're the rising power. Other people say, actually the Iranians are kind of hapless. They invaded Iraq, and then they needed American jets to bail them out when they got bogged down. They invaded Syria, and then they needed Russian jets to bail them out when they got bogged down. And they've been trying to develop a nuke for 20 years. Nuclear weapons are a 70-year-old technology. Our scientists made them with slide rules. How is it that the Iranians are unable to do it? And one of the answers is they're just not that good. Sir, and then you, sir.
Is there any other leverage the international community can put on Iran to be able to retrade?
Legally or not legally? I mean, what could the international community do if the Iranians start either to strengthen the deal or if they start cheating? You could reimpose a sanctions regime. Now, the problem is there are certain parts of the sanctions regime that will probably never get reimposed. I was in a strategy session after the deal came out, and the person who was leading it said, show of hands, whoever thinks the Iranians will ever again be taken off of SWIFT. SWIFT is the European clearinghouse that they use to transmit currency. Taking them off of SWIFT was what sent their economy into a tailspin. Not a single person raised their hand. So there are some things that will never do. But what could the international community do? The international community could act. They could act to isolate Iran. They could move strategic assets into the region. They could pressure their companies not to go back into Iran. They could punish their banks for not doing so. The question is, there appears to be no appetite for doing so. So much does there appear to be no appetite for doing so that an anonymous Iranian official bragged to an American outlet in the last week, said that, listen, we're going to be able to test ballistic missiles with impunity because the Russians and the Chinese will always protect us. I'm sorry, he bragged to Reuters. The Russians and the Chinese will always protect us, and even the West sees us as a gold mine, so they're not going to ever reimpose pressure. That's where the Iranians are sitting. Whether they're right or not, depends on American leadership and so on. Sir?
You addressed what might have happened had the deal been rejected by Congress. But what's your view of what the administration would have actually done had the deal been rejected by Congress?
It's impossible to say because the deal it's difficult to describe the mood in the city during that deal. It was a firestorm. People were saying they would never talk to each other again. The damage would last generations and so on and so on. We don't know. Would the administration have tried to renegotiate? No, they wouldn't have tried to renegotiate. But what they would have done is an open question. Like, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about the kind of debate that's coalescing in town between, like, stop saying you couldn't have done any better. Go do better, right? So, like, the line that they use is it's this deal or no deal and et cetera. And listen, if the Americans had gone back to the Iranians and said, hey, we've got the French with us, we're going to drag the Germans and Brits, or, I mean, how confident are you that we won't drag the Germans and the Brits? Congress's three concerns are ballistic missiles, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the Iranians would have told us, listen, our hardliners are ready to string us up. We're not going to do it. But it's impossible to tell. We do know the Iranian economy was in extreme peril, probably 6 months away from a foreign currency exchange run when in November 2013. We do know that. Anybody who hasn't spoken? Sir. The recent Iranian elections. This gets us a little beyond the deal. Listen, the popular read on the Iranian elections is moderates won. I'm confident saying, again, not flagging for you one side or the other, but down the center. I'm confident enough to say that that's a misreading of the deal, of the elections, in the following way. First of all, there are no moderates in Iran in the center all the way to the right. Wendy Sherman, our top negotiator, a woman who down the line was for the Iran deal, negotiated it, said now a month ago, Rouhani is not a moderate, he's a hardliner. Iran is divided between hardliners and hardliners, right? So let's take off the table the resonance of moderate, but just in a technical sense, moderate individuals were not who was elected to the Iran's Assembly of Experts or the parliament. What happened was this. In the lead up to the elections, there were two elections recently. One for the Assembly of Experts, it selects the supreme leader, one for Iran's parliament. In the lead up to that, Iran's Assembly of Experts disqualified 99% of the reformist candidates. Disqualified them. What happened is that the parties that those people came from were so depleted that to round out their electoral list, they brought in the least bad hardliners into their moderate parties. So the election of moderate parties meant the election of the least bad hardliners that had been able to join that party because because all the reformists had been disqualified. And so it gets into a debate. You, sir, haven't asked a question. What do we get by cozying up to Iran? The administration's position is as follows. Iran is an island of stability in a sea of dissolving states. Iran is a country that is disproportionately young, and those youngsters are Western looking. Iran is a country that is half the size of Europe, and that has the potential to be, as the president said, a very successful regional power. And so the answer is, we have everything to gain by cozying up to Iran if only we can get rid of the animosity. Now the question is, what is the source of that animosity? The president says in as many words that it's because the Iranians have some legitimate grievances and there's been legitimate misunderstandings. We shot down an Iranian plane. According to the president, we interfered with the pre-revolution Iranian political system. And so if we can overcome those, then we can put ourselves on the right side of a rising state. The answer to that, of course, is no, of course it's not that. It's because the Iranian regime is controlled by people who wake up and go to sleep ideologically committed to the eradication of Israel and the expulsion of America from the region. It doesn't have to do with any specific misunderstanding. It has everything to do with them being ideologically committed to the destruction of the United States. I think even Iran watchers, even people who supported the deal, would say right now that hope of moderation, the hopes they had for moderation in the post-deal environment have fallen short. I think it's fair to say that even Iran deal supporters would say that. Somebody who hasn't asked a question. Anybody? Sir. We talked about that earlier. It has to do with a lot was gained by the Corker-Cardin legislation. There's a reason to have bipartisan support of Israel, both generally and specifically in the context of the Iran deal. Sir. Yeah. Sure. Very straightforward question. Iran gets the $100 billion in offshore money. Why would they implement the deal? The administration's answer is, if they cheat, we will snap back sanctions and bring their economy to the brink of destruction. Again, they know it, they won't cheat. The administration also says in moments of where, depending on who's speaking, that the Iranians want better relations with us, that there are elements like the Zarif Rouhani guys who don't want to cheat. They want to implement the deal, and they have no incentive not to, and so they won't do it. That's at least their answer. The counter is there's no way that snapback could work fast enough to change their decision calculus if they decide to rush to the bomb. It's an open question, sir. Yeah. 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 It's a real problem against North Korea. They're also not supposed to be doing that. But the question is how effective they are and whether they're part of the deal and so on and so on. There's answers to that. Guys, I think I have to clear you out. Thank you.